I really enjoy games that give me meaningful choices to change my playstyle to my liking. You know, in these games, maybe you have stat points that you can allocate, skills or traits that maybe they're in a tree and you need to pick the prerequisites, or there's different abilities and upgrades you can choose from. Oftentimes you can pick a character or different weapons and gear, and you can't just pick everything. You know, you need to pick and choose, often just one of many different options. And by doing this, you create a gameplay experience that's uniquely your own, that's suited to your specific tastes. In these games, it's almost like you get to do the last little bit of game design to get an experience a little bit customized to you. And to get definitions going, often you might call what I just described making a build. I'll be using the idea of making a build as a shorthand for that process for the rest of this video. It's not all good though, you've read the title. I've got a problem. You see, I make builds for a living. I make builds to talk about making builds for these videos on this channel and my others. And when I stream, I don't just play the game, no, I talk about making builds with chat, very much like this, just live for several hours straight, several times a week. And what do I do when I'm done with my work? Why, I make some more builds, of course. I certainly play these games in my free time, too. The thing I do the most often, after those two things, is cooking, which is literally just making builds for your tongue. So I definitely have one problem with making builds, which is that I just make way too many builds. I don't do anything else. This is my life. Yeah, but I'm not going to stop, and so I have another problem, which is that it's very hard to find games with build systems that I really enjoy. Now, I gave you that whole prelude because I wanted to emphasize that I'm being picky. I love making builds. It's not remarkable for a game to just have build systems. Lots of games allow you to make some choices. I have a certain amount of choice making that I want. Some people want a game that is a pretty curated experience. They don't want to change much in it. They don't want to have to make something that works and have the option to make something that doesn't work as well. That might not be a positive for some people, but it is for me. I like that when it's calibrated the way I like it. That's just pretty specific. And I know what taste I have in that. I know what specific way of doing that I like in games. And so I want to know that about games before I play them if I'm going to be interested in their build systems. I want the details about those games. I want to know how you get the upgrades. If it's an ongoing game, what kind of ongoing build system additions are there? Does my build reset from time to time? Is this a game where every session you kind of make a build? Or is this more of an ongoing game? Or, you know, details like that. And no problem, normally, when you have this kind of situation, you would watch a review of a game. Maybe some gameplay footage, both. And that would tell you lots of things. That would show you what the game looks and sounds like. It'd give you an idea of the primary gameplay loop where you'll be using the build you make. But it's not going to tell you those specifics. Reviews aren't usually focused on builds specifically. And you might not think that's an issue, but I think that it's a bit more serious than that. I think that traditional games reviewing can't adequately review build systems in games. I don't think it just happens to be the case that people don't do it. I think it is not capable of doing it. I think it cannot do it. And again, you might be thinking, it's no big deal, but variety is the spice of life. Making builds in games or when you're cooking, it's all about variety. And yes, I am crazy, but you, like me, may need more games to make builds in, to get the variety that is the spice of life. But I don't think that traditional reviews can do that for us. So that's a strong claim. Excuse me for getting ahead of myself. I'm Zandy. Welcome aboard. I'll explain why I think this is the case, then I'm going to try reviewing a game for its build systems for you to more clearly illustrate what would be involved. And after that, we'll take a crack at solving this problem. I do have an idea for what might work better. For your sanity, I did not make a video this long about this topic without suggesting a solution. Alright, so why can't traditional reviews, and what even is a traditional review, why can't they adequately review games' build systems? Again, I'm not trying to say that they just happen not to, that there just happens not to be people doing it. I actually don't know that. You know, there could be lots of people doing this, I suppose, but I certainly haven't found them, and I know a lot of you've told me you haven't either. Throughout this section, Now, I want you to hold on to something. There's a lot of reasons why I think this is the case, but it's basically length. Like, the reason is essentially it takes a long time to review a game for its build systems. Why that is a problem is, I think, pretty complicated, but the problem really isn't that complicated. It would either take a very long time to review games this way, and or watching the resulting review would take an impractical amount of time. You could just play the game yourself. That's the idea. It would take a long time because specifically focusing on a game's build systems, if you want to be anywhere near thorough and give a useful and informed conclusion, basically just means you need to play the game a lot. Put simply, you'd be reviewing playing the game in a lot of different ways. You're almost reviewing playing the game a lot. You're just reviewing playing the game, many different potential ways, the possible ways available in the game. But that's not all. You often don't unlock the build systems in a game, the different ways you can play the game, until the end of the game. A lot of the time games are structured in such a way where you unlock these things as a progression system. This has various benefits and detriments, and not all games do this, but for a lot of games you would need to play a lot of the game before you would really begin to see the whole picture of the game's build systems. It might not necessarily be because you don't actually have all the game's build systems, although as a side note, you also wouldn't know if you had all the game's build systems. Some of the time a game doesn't have the most reliable wiki, and you're just not sure if you have all of the game's build systems. This is something a lot of people could maybe accept. The review doesn't have to be absolutely comprehensive, but part of the point is for it to be comprehensive, because people watching the review are looking for systems in the game or ways they can use the systems in the game that fit their specific tastes, that are what they like. So it is important for these reviews to be somewhat more comprehensive, which again, that adds more length. Okay, so you're basically reviewing playing the game a lot, and many games don't even give you all the build systems until near the end anyway. But why does that stuff matter? You're saying, okay, people could just take longer and review, I guess, less games, but they could still review them. What's the problem? For most people on YouTube, here's where we have to talk a little bit about business strategy builds. You're getting your review up later. You reviewed the game for longer and for something more specific. You took longer to put up a review after other people's reviews went up, and your review is more specific in its appeal. You're going to get less views because you put your review up after other reviews and it's more specific in its scope, which means you're going to make less money and your career won't be as sustainable, at least not in that way. But that's not enough of a problem. You could simply have a different business model. People don't think about it, but there are different ways to run a YouTube channel or a career that features a YouTube channel. People just usually do the one that is focused on getting a lot of views. You don't have to get a lot of views to have a successful career on or including YouTube. You could have a business model that is like mine. For example, you could have a business model that's focused on making more money from less people by providing something that those people want more, something more specific. And, I have friends in the industry. I'm happy to tell you that, in fact, I do actually make more money from less people. Again, I hope I'm not being too corporate for you all. I'm happy that it happens that I've been able to provide something that enough of you want more than just some random channel, such that you feel it's worth, say $1 to you a month. So far, that's shaping up pretty well. The business model definitely works. It is just less common. I felt it was important to stress this point simply because a lot of people would stop the conversation here. For many people's channels, there is no more need to discuss this because it would be the death of their career if they did, this type of review. It happens to actually not be a problem at all. For me, this point isn't. But I felt it was important to discuss because it is a big reason why you don't happen to see a lot of people reviewing games for their build systems. You do see a lot of people who dive very deep on one game, and these are often ongoing games, and the community of that game can support a creator like that. That's common, and you see, lots of people review games in general, but you don't often see people combining those two things, and this is part of why. The business model just doesn't really make sense, or again, not a lot of people have that business model. Even if you were to do that, by the way, there is still a catch. If you think about it, reviewing games this way for their build systems, well, the creator, in this case me, I actually would still just have to guess which games I might like. I would be no better off when choosing games. It's just that once I did play them, I could then tell all of you what I thought in a way that would hopefully be elaborate enough to inform your decisions about one game, like once every 3 months or something. You can see why that doesn't sound thrilling to me. I'd have to think that type of review was worthwhile while abandoning it for myself. And I think you've watched enough of this video to know I'm not that kind of person. I want the benefit too. Backing up for a moment, I want to remind you that this isn't just about why people don't happen to review games for their build systems. I am talking about why I don't think it would be that effective even if you did. And now that we've gone all this way, so nothing is physically stopping you, what if you do just review a game for its build systems? Why would that not be very useful anyway? I think this point is quite simple. Most reviews simply rely on things that are not what you want out of a review of a game's build systems. Most reviews rely on primarily two things. The first one is information that is somewhat objective. So these are things like how the game looks and sounds. Obviously, people's computer specs differ, but this is still relatively objective information. If you watch some footage and gameplay of the game, like that is the gameplay of the game, maybe not entirely. Again, there's modding and people's computer builds differ, but you get the point. By and large, you are seeing the game. That part's pretty objective. That's just like watching gameplay. And then the other thing that reviews rely on a lot is basically bias triangulation. So the idea is that the reviewer tells you what their experience was of the game. And then by watching more reviews by that reviewer and or more reviews by other reviewers of that game, you can kind of triangulate and pinpoint how you might feel about the game. It's almost like if you had a lot of acquaintances that all told you what they thought about a game, or one acquaintance who frequently told you what they thought about games. That would help you figure out where your opinion might land, because you would get used to what kinds of things those people said. The problem, of course, is that reviewing a game for its build systems basically is the opposite of that. You're trying to review games in a way that encapsulates other people's responses to the game, not necessarily your own. You can't just magically have all preferences. You might be a person who's willing to enjoy, many different versions of a game, but at the very least, you then need to play all those different versions. At the very least, you need to know of all those different ways you could play a game. No one knows all builds. It's just not entirely possible to review a game halfway to death and then show people that thing. And again, even if you somehow did do all of this, the resulting video would be so long that I'd argue it would just be impractical. Just showing someone all the different intricacies of a game's build system, I would argue even if you somehow did do it, just wouldn't be that helpful. It'd be better to just play the game. All right. For now, no build videos. What if you could get the information you might want from a theoretical build system review of a game without watching a formal review? I will now attempt to review the build systems in Warframe just as an example. Again, I don't want to do a full version of this. I'm doing this so we can see what information you would want to include in such a video, and then maybe we can get it somewhere else. So again, I don't really want to do a build system review of any game. I don't want to review games that way. I have a different idea in mind in part 3. But imagine I'm kidnapped and I have to write a script for a build system review of Warframe. It's an oddly specific request. And so here's the outline I would write, and I'll sort of fill it out with what would be in each section, okay? And that way we'll figure out what maybe we could learn some way other than a build review. I think the first thing I would want would be like an elevator pitch for the game. I want games that uniquely suit my tastes and which are of a good quality, or there's some unique reason to play that game. And so I'd want to know what that reason is. It doesn't have to be something I would like. The reviewer might not know that, but what is something the game is doing uniquely well or uniquely a lot? It might not be a good thing. So for Warframe, what would that be? I guess I would say, okay, so a lot of games achieve the feeling of build diversity, the idea that you can make a variety of builds and they lots of them get the job done. You can actually pick what build you use. You don't have to make one build. There's no clear best build to an extent that it makes it feel wrong to make a choice. A lot of games achieve that effect by doing two things. They make the game's balance relatively lenient. In other words, they don't require you to have a 1% damage increase over something else usually, and balance a lot of the components in the game similarly. And then they also make sure that the game isn't too easy either. Not just anything will work. You do need to come up with a cool synergy or make something powerful, but just not too powerful. The demand is not too high, but not too low. Does that make sense? And so for Warframe, I would say the unique thing that's happening here is that this game has achieved that feeling, for a lot of people anyway. It's a subjective thing, but for a lot of people, while having the requirement for a powerful build be very low, but not so low that it doesn't feel like it doesn't matter what you pick completely. To a lot of people, it's just quite low. And I think the reason why is another unique thing about Warframe. Warframe allows you a lot of different places to get many of its attributes. You could say Warframe has low opportunity cost. When you use a weapon for something very specific in Warframe, well, your loadout has 3, no big deal. 4 if you count your heavy weapon. Maybe you want some ability strength. Well, you could mod that on your Warframe. You could also get that from your weapons, from some weapon arcanes and mods. You could get it from your Parazon or an Archon shard or a different kind of arcane or your companion. There are almost every slot in your loadout allows you to get ability strength is an extreme example. But you get the point. And that level of flexibility means that you can kind of make whatever you want. You can be quite creative, indulgent, you might say, with your builds, and they will still have the capability to be powerful enough, both because the game has very broad balance. In other words, it is very wiggly, flexible, how much power you need to succeed, and lots of different activities you can do of different difficulty levels that are rewarding for an experienced player. And because if you do need more of anything, you could just get it wherever. And that's not necessarily good or bad. Personally, honestly, I actually don't love this about Warframe. I think it's really interesting. It's fun to talk about because it means that when you want to make a build in Warframe, there's a lot of different approaches. That is interesting. I enjoy talking about that. That's something I like about this system, but personally, for my taste, I prefer something that has a bit tighter of a requirement on your builds. I don't like how relatively easy it is to make a combination of things in Warframe that will do the job. I just think it's a bit too open-ended. There's a bit too little opportunity cost, and a lot of the decisions feel a little unnecessary. Technically you could choose wrong, but there's enough right decisions and little enough consequence for making those decisions that I feel like it doesn't matter that much that I made that decision. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I feel. So if I were to say that about Warframe, that's what I would say. I would say it has that unique quality. If you want to just make whatever you want and then figure out how it's going to do enough damage or whatever, I do think Warframe does that quite well in a pretty unique way. And so you might hear that and think, okay, well, I want to try this game. And then I think in this build outline for a review of a game's build systems, you would then want to show the player gameplay. You'd want to show them the gameplay loop of the game where they'll be using the build and what the game looks and sounds like. And this section, a lot of this stuff is, of course, things that you'd have in a normal review. And so you could just watch a traditional review at this part. Let's just say this part, you then watch a traditional review of the game. We don't have to do that. There's lots of those available. Okay, so this is a little better than I expected. It seems like if you kind of give people a pitch for what is the unique appeal of a game, and then they go learn a bunch of other stuff about the game, they are somewhat well equipped to, they know if they're interested in the game. And then from there, it would mostly be that thing at the beginning. I said I want details about the game systems. If the game is an ongoing game, how do you get these upgrades? What is the method by which you acquire them, and how are they added to the game? Are they added in a way that has a certain trend? Has something changed about the game recently? When I listen to advice or input from players about this game, from when is that advice? Like, what is that advice referring to? So there's that part, of course. And there's also figuring out what I like, because after all, if I heard those things, but I don't know which of those qualities I enjoy, in other words, when I say, how is the game updated? How are new systems added to the game's build systems? If I don't have an answer in mind that I know I like, that information doesn't do much for me. So you can see how, kind of like in the first section, there is a lot of information you'd want to provide to the player, but there's another problem, which is that the player statistically probably doesn't even know if they like those things. And most players probably just don't know which of those things they'd prefer. There's just too many choices to some extent. So this brings me, of course, to the real solution to this problem. You've got to get a sense for your taste. And to talk about this subject, I'm going to show you, maybe we could call it a success story example. So this is a game that if I had used a traditional review process to evaluate it, I don't think I would have fared very well. I wouldn't have gotten the right idea about this game, but because I didn't, and I instead focused on my tastes, I did have a good experience with this game. Now, this game is Genshin Impact, and Genshin Impact, I think, is a good example for a few reasons. One of them is that this game is quite popular. Now, that means a lot of things. A game being popular doesn't in and of itself mean anything, of course, but it probably is popular because it's likely to have certain qualities. One of these is that it probably doesn't demand anything too specific of the player, because that's what popular means, general. That's not necessarily bad, but if you want something in a game that is specific, like build systems in a certain way, well, a game that is liked by a lot of people is probably able to appeal to such a broad range of people because it does not have anything in it, no gameplay components, that ask players to do something that not that many players like. Again, that's kind of what popular means. So there's nothing wrong with a game being popular, but for something like a game's build systems, if you want really juicy build systems, I do think it's a little bit unlikely that you're going to find those in a game that is very popular. And another thing about Genshin Impact is that it has a system by which you can roll for characters with a currency you can purchase with real money. Now, of course, this is just basic critical thinking. That doesn't in and of itself mean that the game is, people often say, pay to win, but it does definitely mean that you need to know the details of that system because it might be pay to win. And so you need to find that stuff out. You can see how if you were to just go to the community for one of these games, they would probably not give you the answer you were looking for. You need to figure out what you like in a game and then look for those things in a game like this, because nobody can do it for you. Only you know those things, or only you even can know those things. And so I did. So rather than a traditional review process, the game is free. So I played a little bit and I looked at the game's, build systems is what I wanted. And what I saw is a game, and what you're seeing in the background is a game, that is very focused on its elemental reactions. In Genshin Impact, you see every character has an element. There are 7, and those elements range from having specific reactions with each other to enabling others. So for example, Anemo is an element, wind, that spreads other elements, or kind of enables other elements. So you might spread Pyro, the fire element, onto a bunch of enemies with Anemo. And then if you use Hydro, Pyro and Hydro will form the Vaporize reaction. And this does a very large amount of damage. It increases the damage of the hit that triggers it, and it increases it by even more if that hit is Hydro rather than Pyro. If you trigger it in that order, it's more damage. And all of this means that a lot of the damage in Genshin Impact comes from those systems, or I didn't know that at the time, but once I found out that the game had those elemental reactions, I realized that one of two things was probably true. Either they don't matter at all, or almost all of the game's damage comes from them. And of course, it's the latter. You would think that a game that had these elegant gameplay systems, it's reasonable to wonder if it's made by developers who understand good game design and would make a game with elegant build systems. And in fact, this was the case in Genshin Impact. Now, just to be clear about this point, I'm not trying to suggest that just because a game has potentially good gameplay systems means that it'll be a good fit for you. Of course not. What I'm saying is that's a good way to guess. If you ultimately have to make an educated guess about what games to make builds in, this is a better way to guess than watching reviews or whatever. I saw in this game a game that didn't seem like it was very focused on creating a sense of pay to win or like a need for certain characters. It seemed like this was a game that was fairly interested in making the player create a combination that gave them some meaningful impact. Again, because a lot of the damage comes from elemental reactions in Genshin Impact or combinations of characters, you end up with a game that doesn't heavily reward a character that's maybe a little more powerful. And indeed, the characters that are maybe rarer to roll for are not necessarily simply more powerful. They're powerful in different ways, certainly. But you end up with a game where it's more about combining those characters. Another thing you'll hear from the community of Genshin Impact, as this example goes, is that the game is pretty simple. But the word simple, well, that doesn't mean much on its own. Characters' builds in Genshin Impact are not very multifarious. They don't have a lot of parts. A character has a weapon and a set of artifacts, and some of those can have different primary stats too. So you can very easily say what a character's build is. And then you combine those characters with just their 2 abilities, and they're pretty simple to explain build, into teams, like these 4 character teams you've been seeing. And as you've been able to see, while you have a lot of options for food and weapons and artifacts and stuff, the characters' abilities and builds are simple pieces that you combine in interesting ways, because you can swap characters pretty much freely, and this allows you to combine their abilities. Most of their effects remain in play when you swap characters, as you're seeing me do now. I've enabled a bunch of hydro abilities that will fire off while my pyro character attacks, so I can trigger vaporize reactions, almost as if it was just that character by themselves, but I'm getting help from my teammates' buffs. Again, this creates a game that is clearly designed to have crisp, clean build systems. They're not complicated, but that wouldn't be good. They're easy to understand. That's a good thing. Well, that's a good thing for me. That's what I want. And so this is a game that it does appeal to me, but the way other people talk about it, you wouldn't know. So taste is my answer. I think that the more productive thing to do is for me to make videos about game systems, basically about video game design, but focused on build systems, so that you can evaluate the ones you like for yourself. So you know what's out there and you know what to look for. And then if you find out that information about a game, you can sort of review it for yourself a little bit. I just think this is more effective than covering a bunch of individual games. I think it's more helpful to have the target in mind. You could maybe know what you're looking for a little bit better, rather than just showing you what would essentially just be random or very specifically biased for my tastes examples, if that makes sense. And that's it. So I hope you think that's a reasonable idea. I think it will work. So that's the plan, to focus on making videos to develop taste. I think that's more valuable than if I reviewed a ton of essentially random or just my taste games. And I hope that those of you who ended up at the end of the video here, it's those of you for whom that sounds useful. I hope you'll come along with me, give it a shot. I think it'll be fun. And I want to thank some of you who've decided that it is worth a little bit to you. I talked about, my business model is that I'm hoping to provide something specific, and that it is going to be worth a little bit of money to some of you every month. And I want to thank those of you who've decided that it is. Thank you for supporting me on Patreon, through YouTube members, and through Twitch subscriptions, either paid or Prime subs. Thank you very much for your support. Without your support, I will have to stop doing this. This is my job, so it's been very encouraging so far. We'll see if we can make it work. Next time, we will continue our adventure. Stay frosty out there.